So welcome to Transform Gov, the digital government podcast, and I'm your host, Maeve Neefsey. Transform Gov is part of the Ireland e-Government Awards and is proudly brought to you in association with Accenture. Each episode we uncover how digital is reshaping public services and explore the groundbreaking work that's changing how government is serving the citizen. Today our guest is Martin Quigley, and he is Director of Data and Analytics with Pobal, and winners of the Ireland e-Government Awards general category for their work in developing the HP Deprivation Index. More of that later. Martin, you're very welcome to Transform Gov.
Thank you very much.
So look, before we get started, I think it's kind of fair to say that you've always been very interested in, and very active actually, in social justice, and that maybe influenced your decision to become a civil servant, because before that you had a successful startup company. So maybe just tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. I'd say it's probably fair to say that I'm sort of somebody who's long-term been involved in social inclusion and social justice, who works in data and analytics rather than a data and analytics person who works in a social inclusion organisation. So that very much has been my career path to date. I would originally trained as a social care worker. And then worked for about 5 years with Focus Ireland as a frontline outreach worker.
Which means you were out
walking the streets of Dublin, working with primarily young adults experiencing homelessness.
Okay.
So I did that for a number of years, then went back and got involved in kind of research and policy work, did an internship with the Irish Penal Reform Trust, a master's degree in criminology, and then I kind of started to work in the field of criminology and doing evaluations of criminal justice projects, primarily not-for-profit criminal justice projects. And it was around that time then that myself and two other colleagues would have set up a not-for-profit consultancy company. So we were a consultancy providing services to the not-for-profit sector, but ourselves were a social enterprise not-for-profit entity.
Okay, so I suppose, what do you think sparked your interest in social justice and equality?
Well, I suppose I'd go back to probably, to my father. He passed away when I was quite young, but he would have been a social worker. So I kind of always knew that was the area that I wanted to work in, either kind of social work or social care work. So that would have been the start of, the start of my career. And then it's more gone into the area of supporting not-for-profit organisations, community voluntary charities to understand their work and tell their story better. And that's primarily what we would have done, or what I would have done when I worked with Quality Matters, the organisation that we established back in 2012, supporting organisations to have better information management systems, to understand how to improve, generate efficiencies within their organisations, but then also to be able to explain to their funders, be able to better tell their story
through data.
Through data.
And with you, did you train to be a data scientist? Did you? No. So you are now.
I would say I can communicate quite well with data scientists. I wouldn't claim to be a data scientist myself. So certainly from the perspective of actually doing the stats and doing the hard edge of data science and coding in R and Python, I wouldn't trust myself to do any of that, but would have, I suppose, a working knowledge of being able to communicate with people who do. And I suppose I would see my job largely as the bridge between the business and understanding the problems to be solved, then working with some very talented technical people on my team to develop data solutions or data products.
And so you were Quality Matters, which is the company you set up, which still exists.
Yep.
How did that? Were you doing roles within, working, in other words, with Pobal, for example, and then we decided to make the move, or how did that happen?
Correct. We would have been working with Pobal, providing support on one of the programs that Pobal managed in the area of information management and outcome reporting. Was doing some work with Pobal. And I suppose my attitude at the time would have been, if only the funders understood what was really happening, if only they got it. And then I ended up in a role where I was quickly looking at some of the challenges from the other side then as well. So turned
money where your mouth was then.
Turned poacher to gamekeeper back in 2015. Yeah.
2015. Okay. And do you believe that data can change the whole face of government? Do you see it impacting on future government in a big way?
Really, really do. So, I'm very privileged over the last 9 years now with Pobal to have witnessed a lot of that and to have seen, many, many instances, and we'll hopefully get to talk about a couple of them, where, certainly my team and I have been able to support government in terms of policy development, in particular in terms of policy implementation, to target resources to the communities most at need. And I suppose that's one of the key things that that my team and I would be involved in, is using the tools of data science and data analytics to be able to answer some of those real hard-edge policy implementation problems of where precisely should money go, what's most effective, how does government get the most bang for buck in terms of trying to support, say, disadvantaged communities or particular disadvantaged target groups.
And is the focus of Pobal in particular focused on a disadvantage?
Yeah.
Or does it take a role also in opportunity, where you say, look, there's a trend going on here, we need to capitalise on it?
Yeah, and I would say a bit of both. I should maybe give a brief introduction to Pobal.
That would be really useful.
Some of your listeners may not be particularly familiar with this. We're relatively big, I suppose, as a semi-state agency, but wouldn't necessarily have a major national profile, because a lot of the work we do is in supporting a range of government departments. So we're established to promote social inclusion and equality in partnership with government and communities. What that means in practice is we're largely a grant-making agency. So we would work with a range of government departments in the delivery and implementation of currently 39 different programs or schemes on behalf of those departments. They would range from, so we do an awful lot of work with the Department of Children, Disability Integration Youth. We do a lot of work with the Department of Children, so things like the National Childcare Scheme, ECCE, the 2 free preschool years. We manage both of those on behalf of the department. So a lot of work would be involved on that side, right through to the other end of the life course, say the Seniors Alert Scheme. So we would work with the Department of Rural and Community Development, who are our parent department. We would work with them on the implementation of the Seniors Alert Scheme, and that's where people over the age of 65 can avail of free pendants and security systems for their homes. And a range of programs then in between. So things like the Dormant Accounts Fund, we're increasingly involved now in a range of measures around, say, climate justice, such as the Zero Emission Vehicle Ireland electric charge points. So really interesting from a data science perspective of how does government decide where to put new charge points. So a lot of data work there on traffic volumes and demographics. Right through to then working, say, with the Department of Health on Sláinte Care Integration Fund and Healthy Ireland Fund. So very wide range.
Very broad. Very
wide range.
Do you know, what was Pobal's approach to digital transformation? I mean that in its broadest sense.
Yes.
So, it probably evolved over the years, but how has it impacted on the organisation itself, and what way did you approach it?
So I would say it's been periods of a relatively organic growth, and then also a number of intentional steps around the development where we have, intentionally looked at sort of digital transformation as a process or project. Currently working on the latest iteration of our data and technology strategy. But I'd say over the course of the 9 years, a lot of the growth has been organic. There's been a huge growth in Pobal as an organisation. When I joined 9 years ago, there would have been 220 staff. There was 771 this morning when I checked.
Okay, so it's a big transformation. Does that reflect the importance of data, do you think, or is it more that you are a fairly new organisation and you're only growing?
So Pobal's around about 30 years.
Okay, so it's not that new.
So we're not that new. There's been a lot of growth in terms of our work on the early years, early learning and care side of things. And likewise, I think as with all areas of government, understanding from a data perspective what's going on in terms of those programs is increasingly important. So likewise, while the organisation has seen fairly significant growth, so is the data team. When I would have joined as the head of the team, there was maybe 8 of us. Now as the Director of Data and Analytics, there's a directorate of 37 at the moment. So there's been fairly large growth of the Data and Analytics Directorate. And I think even things like making it a specific, making it its own directorate alongside ICT and corporate and compliance does give a weight to data and analytics within the organisation. And certainly when we look at the strategic plan of the organisation, which my directorate would have been, I suppose, kind of central in terms of developing to ensure that it was very evidence-based and data-driven strategic plan. An awful lot of weighting within the strategic plan is around the data and analytical component of what we provide to government as a service offer, in terms of being able to provide a independent, impartial, objective but reliable voice in terms of an assessment of what's working and what isn't.
So it's a critical role because, you're talking about supports and funding to areas that need it most.
Yeah.
And so you have to trust that data. But I suppose going back to just give people a practical sense of what happens, you get constant stream of questions, and I presume that are going to be put before the Oireachtas. So what kind of information are you providing?
So this is one of the things that certainly enjoy about the job is that no 2 days are the same. We operate a mailbox to members of the Oireachtas and various government departments. So one of the key pieces that we do is we manage, I think last year it was about 1,200 ad hoc queries.
Okay.
Now that's on top of dozens, if not hundreds, if you include the daily reports of reports that we're already providing back. So we provide a function called Funder Queries. People will ask us a question, and sometimes the answer is relatively straightforward, and we have an existing report or dashboard we can pull the figure from. An awful lot of the time, actually, it's a bespoke analysis project to answer this one particular question. So we have quite a large team, as I mentioned. There's maybe 25 on the data, on the monitoring analysis and outcomes unit, who would be primarily responsible for that function, who respond to those queries and identify ways of answering them. That because you're talking several a day, like it's quite high volume, and as you say, very often these responses are, they're either being used for policy development, maybe they're being used within government for submissions for funding to the public expenditure and reform. Very often they might be from an Oireachtas member, so these figures will be read into the Dáil record by the Taoiseach or by the relevant minister. So when you're operating to, for that level, things need to be right, and they need to be right every time. We don't want to end up in a scenario where we're having to correct the Dáil record. And when I would have started, I remember 9 years ago, on my second day, we had our first one of these queries, and I was terrified because we only got a handful of them. We would a handful of them a week, whereas now there's several every day. So ramping up to that scale has also, as you can imagine, meant that we've really needed to come along in terms of the journey of data governance maturity in a way that we wouldn't have been before. I suppose
on a practical level, how were you doing this before the kind of digital transformation within the organisation? How do you do it now? Because I can imagine, I'm imagining, a lot of Excel's involved, a lot of trying to dig into information to find things, difficult to query things, possibly duplication of information. So give us a kind of a before and after.
Yes, yeah. And I'd say it's as much a before and after where we want to get to, because I wouldn't say we're necessarily all the way there. By virtue of working across 39 discrete different programs, we do still have a lot of data silos. And even when you put all the data into one place, if the type of information being asked under one program is different to the type under another program, it can be in one large server. But unless your data points are the same, that's very challenging. And that requires us to get to a place of data harmonization, working with multiple government departments, where I suppose we would be trying to suggest to individual departments that they might change how they record, say, target groups. So we might consider,
consistency, and
one program might just call young people, under the age of 25, another under the age of 21, another is work, with these different categories that you can't add together. So that's one of the key challenges. That does mean we're still operating off some of those Excel sheets and data silos. I'd say much better than we were previously. Probably the area where we've seen a lot of development in terms of that maturity would be our early years programs, where we've developed a data warehouse and put in
it was a greenfield site in a way, wasn't it?
It was quite greenfield site. There was a new ICT system brought in back in 2019, so we were able to effectively build a new data warehouse as a reporting server, as a reporting sort of architecture for that new system. That's allowed us to probably be, I'd say, more mature from that perspective in relation to those programs. But we're still dealing with some of those legacy challenges that you've guessed.
Yes, I'm just thinking we have an interview coming out on our next episode with Lisa Griffith, who's from the Digital Repository of Ireland.
Yeah.
And they are, and look, I won't get into the detail of it, but a huge amount of what they're doing is getting people to archive and use their platform to archive material. But the challenges are the same in a way, because they're trying to get consistency in terminology and metadata and formats in order for them to be able to say, okay, we've got 58 sets of data, 50 million sets of data, but if we look up a particular topic, we can cross-reference it quickly because everybody's using the same descriptors, relatively speaking. I'm simplifying it. But I presume to some extent that's the kind of best practice in housekeeping that you were trying to develop within your department for but also dealing with all the different stakeholders, different departments that are coming into you.
And I suppose it's fair to say we've found that it's quite an upstream issue of working with policymakers to say when it comes to developing a new program, let's attempt to align those definitions with these different programs across government. It's very difficult afterwards to come in and try to retrofit or rejig that data. Very often, actually, it's quite an upfront policy choice that if we can align our definitions, if we can align our target groups, even when it comes to, say, some of the financial information that you're trying to join together from various programs, if you've got two different government departments who've used slightly different definitions of liquidity ratio and they've come to look at, at applications under the different programs, and then you try to aggregate that, again, you're working on two slightly different definitions, and it becomes virtually impossible. So trying to get that alignment up front and advocate for that is, would be a key part of what we do.
Yeah. And in terms of, the transition to digital, was it difficult? And I don't mean just technically difficult. I mean culturally difficult.
Yeah.
And how did you manage that?
Maybe one of the practical examples I'd use around that, we've seen a lot of uptake. So I'll reference the Pobal HP Deprivation Index.
Yes, please.
Which would be Ireland's primary social gradient tool. And I can go into as much detail as you want.
Loads of questions for you.
on structural equation modelling if you want. But what we've found is a lot of our work actually, because every 5 years we work with Jonathan Bratchka now, who develops the index on our behalf, and we launch it and we make it publicly available. But that's sort of a 5-yearly project. Most of the work we would do with the deprivation index in the intervening time is practically supporting a range of government departments to utilise the index for particular policy initiatives. So possibly I'd say the most highly recognisable use case would be the DESH model by the Department of Education and Skills. But I could list off another 20 policy areas where it's used. It's very widely used in health. And it's used across a range of programs that Pobal would manage, in particular on behalf of the Department of Rural and Community Development.
Useful for people to understand what the HP Deprivation Index is.
Yep.
And then just to put it in context.
Sure. So it's, as I mentioned, it's Ireland's primary social gradient tool. What that means is for each of the, so a little bit of technical detail for a moment. For each of the 18,919 small areas in the country, we come up with a score between sort of -40 and +30. And that single score is an aggregate of a range of different measures from the census, which allows us to describe an area as being either affluent or disadvantaged, or for 70%, so it's a normal distribution curve, for 70% of the population marginally above or marginally below average, about 15% of the population living in areas of affluence, and about 15% of the population living in disadvantaged areas. So using that index, we're then able to very specifically see, well, where are those disadvantaged areas? And so as I mentioned, the 15% disadvantaged, you're then talking maybe 3% of areas that are very disadvantaged. And I suppose that's particularly important, I think, when it comes to place-based policies. Okay. So policies that are looking at targeting particular areas. So things like, as I mentioned, the DESH model and schools where there's a particular concentration of children from disadvantaged backgrounds. And I suppose the key thing that we would have observed is an increasing appetite across government to use tools like this.
But I think really you're kind of, in a way, you're right. I mean, everything you said, of course, it's correct. But the beauty of it is how accessible that information is made through the index.
Yep.
Because it's visual. You can decide to drop certain things, add certain things, focus in on a particular area. Yep. And I think, I presume that's been quite revolutionary for the policymakers.
So one of the key things with this, and I suppose our continuing attempts to ensure that it's recognised as being, Ireland's primary way of understanding deprivation and affluence at the geographic level. One of the key enablers of that is absolute transparency and trying to make sure that, so for anybody who hears about the index and, hears maybe that it's being used by policymakers for a particular programme, they can log on to Pobal Maps, maps.pobal.ie. They can look at their area. I don't know the stats on this, but I'd say we're one of the best best accessed government data visualization tools. We would get hundreds of thousands of hits on an annual basis. We probably tap into a little bit of people's natural curiosity and nosiness.
Dare I say? Look for their area.
Everybody zooms into their area. And I think that adds a degree of weight and sort of face validity to it. The people log in and go, yeah, that makes sense. This area versus that area, there is a different profile of people who live there. And that makes sense when we look at it in that way. So that really adds that degree of, it adds that degree of face validity from the perspective of citizens, which then I think in turn allows policymakers to use it in a way that, they're generally quite happy to say,
we've used
the index. It's
faceless government coming up with a number and saying that's it.
Yes.
People can interrogate and understand how they've arrived at that. But you were going to use that as, I suppose, an example of transformation.
Yeah.
And how you, the difficulties are otherwise of making that transition.
Yeah. And so I suppose the overarching point that I would be making is that certainly over the last number of years, we've seen an increasing number of departments and divisions within the departments coming to us and saying, look, are there ways that we can use the index? There is, say, a geographic component to our policy, or the part of the policy is intended to be aimed at the most disadvantaged. Is there a way that that we can add your index as part of our program or part of our operationalization? If I give an example, maybe that one of the policy domains areas that I've, my team and I have really enjoyed working on and got a huge amount of a huge amount of meaning out of doing has been working with the Department of Children on the Equal Start model. So that would be quite similar to the DESH model, but for early learning and care. So over the last, and it was only launched this summer actually by Minister O'Gorman. So that model, I'll stop talking about data and a model for a moment, but if you consider that there's 4,500 early learning and care services in the country, centre-based childcare, creches, Montessori's, 4,500 of those in the country. What we know from research is that the areas where there is the highest concentration of children coming from disadvantaged backgrounds, the nature of those services is quite different in terms of what needs to be provided, say, from a psychosocial support perspective, in terms of family supports. Very often there's intergenerational jobless households, there may be substance misuse, involvement in the criminal justice sector. All of these things concentrate in more disadvantaged areas. Not to say that everybody in disadvantaged areas is experiencing those, but there's much higher concentration. And that changes the tone of services that is provided in some of those areas, especially for young children in experiencing disadvantage or deprivation. And what we also know from research from the ESRI is that the socio-emotional outcomes of children who attend high quality childcare is improved is improved for children who are coming from disadvantaged backgrounds. It doesn't completely level the playing field, but it goes quite a long way. So we know that. And then I suppose what the Department of Children had aimed to do in terms of the policy was, well, how do we then identify those particular services and provide additional funding, additional services? And that's where we were able to step in with the deprivation index. So rather than it becoming, say, an essay writing contest for service providers to make their case, what we were able to do was...
or even a lobbying.
Or lobbying. Yeah. What we're able to do is use the objective administrative data we have. So we have the address of every child on National Childcare Scheme or ECCE who's accessing services. Having those addresses, we're able to geocode them, assign them deprivation scores, supplement that with, even if they're not living in a disadvantaged area, but they are, say, living in a homeless service or they're living in an IPAS centre or are coming from certain ethnic backgrounds, we can assign a disadvantage score for every child. We then aggregate that to the service level. And we've then been able to use this to create an objective evidence-based model that says this 750 of the 4,500 services have a concentrated, have a concentration of children from disadvantaged areas. And actually, if, considering we have limited zero sum of resources, those are the 750 services who would benefit most from it. So a very kind of evidence-based way. And
so that appetite,
yeah,
has that come from externally, or you've internally been able to create that and offer it as a service? How does that dynamic work?
I would say it's both. I'd say we have good relationships with the range of government departments. As I mentioned, it was very much the policy intent of the Department of Children was to have a targeted model, and I think we were able to support them as saying, well, given your policy intent, we believe we can support. We can help with, by using the deprivation index, by using our experience of how you use the deprivation index for something like this. We were able to offer that as a support. And I suppose in the spirit of collaboration, we would have worked very closely with the department on a number of iterations for that particular policy initiative.
Okay. So was there a cultural shift to start using digital technologies to help answer the questions and provide information?
I would say there has, but not necessarily sure it was an intentional cultural shift. I would say that we had to change how we were doing things by virtue of the increased scale that we were operating at. So where we would previously have approached a lot of data work, almost kind of like a mini piece of research or an analysis project. Yeah. We had to, and I would say we're still in the process of changing some of that thinking to how we develop more data products, or we consider the longer term data pipeline. So, my own background, many of my colleagues in the team would come from social sciences. We get a good problem, excellent. We sit down and we go, okay, so we acquire the data, we clean the data, we transform it, we run an analysis, and we do a write-up. And that's the style of project. And that will answer a particular question, but you can't rerun that tomorrow. Or at least it becomes very resource intensive to do that. So that's probably where we've gone into over the last couple of years in terms of investing then in terms of expertise such as a data engineer who would have on board. I've mentioned the technology such as the data warehouse, looking at that pipeline of data and information to ensure that we're not just doing ad hoc or one-off projects, but that we're properly building products that can be reusable. But I would say that requires two things. That requires more maturity of internal systems. It also requires more maturity of the questions that are being answered, being asked. Because, of course, you can't be as quickly responsive when it comes to building a lengthy data pipeline. You need to be pretty sure that what you're building is going to answer a very important question into the long term.
And in terms of, again, to articulate the benefits, I suppose, in a way, or the outcomes, are there big wins that people have experienced as a result of being that more flexible organisation, being able to access wider, larger scale data sets that you've seen happen both for your team, I suppose, but also maybe for the Irish citizen?
Well, I'd say look, certainly we've managed to upgrade things like Pobal maps, which is how people access the system. Much more, I'd say, where we've invested in terms of skills and expertise on our side is being able to answer that question when departments come to us and say, how can we use this? Because ultimately the deprivation index is just a table with 18,919 rows, range of columns that describe things like the level of affluence and disadvantage and lone parent ratios, et cetera, But the most common question we would get is, how do we use that as part of our policy? And there's a whole range of different ways, So in some, maybe one practical example would be the Department of Sport would have been using the deprivation index for quite a while when they would have applicants for sports capital. So as part of the process, obviously, there's going to be more applicants than there is funding, so it's a competitive application process. One of the appraisal criteria is the level of need in the area, and they would have always used the deprivation index as one of the measures of that. One of the problems, though, is that they were using the score of the small area in which the facility was located, and it could just be on the corner of a particular small area. Classic example might be that it's just on the corner of an area in the IFSC, which is quite affluent, but it's actually supporting, say, the northeast inner city, which is not. However, because it's a single point in the earth, we're giving it that particular score. So what we were able to do in terms of just the expansion out of different data products was work with that department and establish something we've termed now, and we'd use it across quite a range of programs, called the bespoke radial model, where we'll look at a point in the earth, but we'll also then look outside that particular point. We'll draw a circle around each point. So, and a point being the location of somebody who's applied for funding. We'll look at in the surrounding area, and we'll calculate a bespoke deprivation score based on a particular circle. The circle, again, I'll go into a little bit of detail. Mm-hmm. The size of the circle is a function of population density, because we need to have one model that works for, I mentioned, the northeast inner city. It also needs to work for Donegal. So what we do is, in a rural area, it's a larger circle. In an urban area, it's a smaller circle. Course. So we figured out kind of the maths to be able to run one model that can work consistently across the country, but works in both the urban and the rural setting. So that type of function has been really helpful, because I suppose in previous years, the way in which the deprivation index could be used as a means of supporting policy was much blunter, I'd say, than it is now. And the benefit is, once we were able to develop that model for the Department of Sport, we reran it this week for the latest round of the Community Centre Investment Fund Category 2. We were able to, and at relatively low cost, it took a couple of hours of processing. It wasn't, so one of the benefits is, as we develop those conceptual models of solving problems, we can then apply them for more and more government department partners and sponsors in a way that is relatively low cost.
So you've got that fantastic foundation, really, in which you can then squeeze and kind of do different models on top of it.
Yeah.
And in terms of resource allocation, do you believe it's fairer now because of people's access to the HP deprivation index?
I certainly do, and I suppose I would have a lot of evidence that is the case. Be it, say, the LEADER programme, certainly in rural Ireland would have a lot of visibility.
Just remind people of what the LEADER programme is.
So it's EU funding that would go to I suppose, in particular to rural parts of the country. To promote local economic development. So I think it's in the region of sort of 200 million over a 4 or 5 year period. Fairly significant in investment. And while each county will allocate funding under LEADER, under a competitive process based on a series of criteria, the amount of funding from that national pot that goes to each county is calculated on the basis of population and deprivation.
Okay, so direct.
Yeah,
absolutely direct.
Population, urbanity, rurality, is another measure, and deprivation. So those are the three key things that go into, say, for example, the LEADER RAM. That's how we would call it, the resource allocation model. Likewise, for the social inclusion community activation programme, it's a fund of about 42 million per year that would fund community development workers across the country. Primarily, more than that, but that would be what a primary function is. And again, that's the national resource allocation model for that. It utilises the deprivation index. Another one more example would be, say, the Just Transition Fund. So for the 5 Midlands counties and some slivers of other counties, where investment and funding is being made available to counties that are in particular impacted by the closure of peat bogs. We came up with the resource allocation model for that, which included measures of population, measures of unemployment, and measures of deprivation, and measures of square meterage of bogland.
Okay. So one size doesn't fit all.
One size doesn't fit all.
But then you can use create the same a model and use the same data.
Conceptual model and just say, okay, so what are the particular data measures we want to put into it? But it's the same base code that we write, and then we end up having these really interesting, and I say one of my favourite discussions with policymakers is when we get into saying, well, how much weighting are we giving to population versus deprivation versus square meterage of bogland? Very often it's that question of population versus disadvantage or deprivation, and it's forcing the conversation in a really practical and tangible way of saying, how universal versus how targeted is this policy initiative on many of our policies would be described as progressive universalism. This forces the question of, well, is it 60%? Is it 40%? Is it 50%? Really specifically. And that's a discussion that I certainly really enjoy with policymakers.
I can't believe we're actually 35 minutes into the podcast.
Oh, wow.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a pause. We're going to have another podcast because there's loads more questions to ask you. And I think it's relevant to so many parts of the public sector, what we're talking about. So I'm going to take a break. I'm going to thank you, of course, for doing part one with me. Martin, thank you so much. I'm also going to thank the team because they're in there and they're probably going, what's Maeve doing? She's changing things now of another recording. But anyway, so our team is producer Conal Moran, our studio manager is Peter Rice, our video editor is Neil Horner, our sound engineer and videographer is Lee Brennan. And finally, thank you to South Dublin Podcast Studios. And of course, Martin, thank you.
Thank you very much.